Welcome to everybody for joining us to the annual Jan and Mildred Memorial Lecture. So my name is Claire Lefort and I'm the director of the wonderful Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish and Non-Jewish Relations at the University of Southampton. So the annual Carton Memorial Lecture is an opportunity really to celebrate the work and the significant and vital support brought by our main donor, the Ian Carton Charitable Trust. And it's also an opportunity to celebrate the success of the Parks Institute since its creation. Most of you will know that the Reverend Dr. James Parks, who fought against antisemitism from the 1920s, donated his library to the University of Southampton in 1964. And since then, the center has grown into a major institute. It was recognized as such as an institute in 2000 by the university, and it has made a contribution to the research and public knowledge about Jewish non-Jewish relations locally, nationally, and globally. So we are a vibrant community of scholars, archivists, librarians, and we publish 3 journals and are also home to a thriving community of undergraduate and postgraduate students. And the Ian Carton Charitable Trust was at the forefront, or has been at the forefront of the growth of the Institute. So a few words about Ian Carton. So he was a young refugee who had been able to come to Britain in the late 1930s on a studentship at what became part of the University of London. He actually met James Parks at a garden party in Parks' home in Cambridgeshire. And he was very impressed, not only by the chance to see what became the Parks Library, but also by the generosity and kindness of James Parks at putting him at ease in an alien environment. And this was really part of James Parks' wider work in helping refugees, especially students, in escaping from persecution. Ian became a successful engineer, and with his wife, Mildred, he created later in his life a trust to help those like him who needed extra support through education to develop their careers. And since then, the Carton Trust has supported thousands of students. It has also set up hundreds of centers in Britain and Israel to help physically disabled people develop themselves through the use of technology. At the University of Southampton, Ian Carton's generosity began with support for MA students on our Jewish History and Culture program. He then supported the creation of a postdoctoral fellowship, which was first occupied by Sarah Pierce, who is now a Carton professor in the study of Jews in antiquity and who is our current head of school. And the support continued and increased. So the Carton Trust created several lectureships and supported outreach. And indeed, outreach work in schools, colleges, and adult education was at the core really of Ian's interests. And we are really delighted that through the Trust generosity, we are able to reach such a wide audience. And most recently, the Trust has also supported our shift to cultural and digital activity and the recruitment of our digital coordinator, Katie Power. The support given by the Carton Trust is now over £2 million. In 1998, Ian Carton was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Southampton. Sadly, we have lost both Ian and Mildred, and this annual Jan and Mildred Carton Memorial Lecture is a way of remembering really 2 outstanding individuals. This year, we are most fortunate to welcome Nancy Sinkoff for this Carton Memorial Lecture. So Nancy Sinkoff is Professor of Jewish Studies and History and the Academic Director of the Vilna Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers University. I never know how to pronounce.
Rutgers.
Rutgers. Thank you. I'm really sorry. She's the author of many very important books, especially for the history of Jews in Eastern Europe. She's the author of From Left to Right, Lucy's Dawidowicz, The New York Intellectual and the Politics of Jewish History, published in 2020. But the paperback edition has just been released, and we will put you a link in the chat because it's really a bargain, $25. She has won many prizes with this book. So the Nathan Notable Book in 2020, the National Jewish Book Award in the category of biography in 2020. She has also co-edited a volume with Rebecca Cypers on Sarah Levy's World, Gender, Judaism, and the Bach Tradition in Enlightenment Berlin, also winner of the Outstanding Book Prize from the Jewish Studies and Music Study Group of the American Musicology Society. She is also co-editing a volume that is forthcoming in the autumn, I think, on Polish Jewish culture beyond the capital. And her first book, Out of the Shtetl, was reissued recently, so on making Jews modern in the Polish borderlands. And tonight she will be talking about Lucy Dawidowicz and the beginnings of urban Forschung, so Holocaust studies in the United States. So Nancy, very many thanks for agreeing to give the Carlton Memorial Lecture, and the floor is yours. And I will share.
Thank you so much, Professor Lefol, and thank you, Katie Powers, for the behind the scenes. I want to thank also Professor Kushner and everyone affiliated with the Parks Institute. I'm thrilled to be here. Please, someone assure us that you can see the PowerPoint. I have a lot of screens, so if someone can just tell someone that we can see it, I will be indicating to Professor Lefol to advance it as I give my narrative.
We can see it.
Thank you very much. So let me begin. The formal title of the lecture is Lucy S. Dawidowicz, 1915 to 1990, and the beginnings of Forschung, which could be translated or should be translated as Holocaust research in the United States. Of course, even already there, you see that we have a translation issue between Yiddish and English, and that is very relevant to everything about the woman who became Lucy S. Dawidowicz. You'll see that before she becomes Lucy S. Dawidowicz, she is Lucy Schildkret, and we can talk a little bit more about not only her marriage and her name, but why that's significant. So let me begin with slide 2, the next slide. So can everyone see the second slide that says Cynthia Ozick at the top? Yes?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. Okay, so now we can start. So formally now beginning. In October 1987, Cynthia Ozick, a very important post-war American Jewish writer whose fiction, exemplified by her 1969 story, Envy, or Yiddish in America, was deeply embedded. She remains deeply embedded in East European Jewish culture. And she was very close to Lucy S. Dawidowicz, who apparently sometime in the late 80s communicated to Cynthia that she was going to destroy all of her papers. And Cynthia Ozick wrote this to Lucy Dawidowicz. Please, please stop now, Lucy. It's ruthless, it's unfair, particularly in the case of Shimon's letters, which are safe as if written in code because they're in Yiddish. If you don't have storage space, let a library take your papers. If you let it be known, 24 universities will be at your feet, and you won't have to think about these documents anymore. And Shimon's letters, think how he would feel. He would be hurt, wouldn't he? Or he would be pragmatic. He would admonish you. He would beg you to stop, Lucy. Imagine Shimon's thoughts concerning what you were doing. Imagine the thoughts of future scholars, of your biographers. This letter raises a number of compelling issues about Lucy S. Dawidowicz, the subject of my book and of tonight's talk. We now know that despite her apparent despair, Dawidowicz listened to Ozick, at least partially. She appears to have destroyed the letters and private papers from her husband, Shimon. I couldn't find no record of them except a little handwriting on some letters, some memos that she wrote from abroad. And she clearly did not want her private life exposed by a biographer. But she did ask her friend, Neil Kozodoy, to bequeath her public papers, those who dealt with public topics, to the American Jewish Historical Society. Neil Kozodoy was then the editor of Commentary Magazine, one of the most influential American Jewish periodicals in the post-war years. And as her executor, he did what Lucy asked. And all of her official papers are at the American Jewish Historical Society, not actually at the YIVO Institute. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A, why she made that decision. But this rich archive illustrates that Dawidowicz wanted to be remembered as an historian of the Jews of Eastern Europe. And she wanted also to ensure that the history of the vital civilization of Ashkenazic Jewry be remembered. And she wanted to be known as its American chronicler. That is, she wanted her work on the destruction of East European Jewish culture to be part of the way American Jews understood themselves. So who was she? At one point, she was a household name, now far less so. Lucy Dawidowicz is primarily known, if she is known, as an historian of the brutal destruction of European Jewry during the Holocaust. But she was also a contentious female Jewish public intellectual whose life and work intersected with the central issues that shaped Jewish life in the 20th century, such as the viability of secular Yiddish culture, the salvage and rescue of Jewish cultural treasures after the war, the Cold War ideological battle against communism, her reaction to what she perceived to be the crisis of post-war liberalism in the late 1960s with the rise of feminism, the civil rights movement, the New Left, and the impact on Jewish communal life, and the role of American Jewish intellectuals in New York City in the emergence of the movement known as neoconservatism. She wrote 7 books, co-edited 2, contributed over 60 articles to Commentary at the height of its influence, and she was an indispensable part of the American Jewish Committee's research team. And the American Jewish Committee was the foremost Jewish defense agency in the US in the post-war years. Dawidowicz was an outspoken figure in American Jewish communal life until her death in 1990. And she was a touchstone for many Americans and American Jews, including the male New York Jewish intellectuals who by the 1960s sort of re-encountered her as she became a public persona. And we can talk more in the Q&A about the relationship between the male New York Jewish intellectuals and Lucy S. Dawidowicz, and why many of them, Irving Howe, Lionel Trilling, Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, maybe Nathan Podhoretz, Nathan Glazer and Norman Podhoretz, excuse me, may be more known today to many people outside of Jewish studies than someone like Lucy Dawidowicz. Part of what I claim in my book is that she became very important to them. Tonight's lecture is going to focus, and we can turn to slide 3, on her relationship to what we now call Holocaust studies, and what she might have been reluctant to call, but she might have been more sympathetic to calling it Forschung in Yiddish. In this field of, again, Holocaust studies, Lucy Dawidowicz was a central figure in what is known as intentionalist historiography. She argued that the final solution was a deliberate result of Hitler's virulent, murderous anti-Semitism, which governed both his domestic and foreign policy. By the mid-1970s, her writing informed both the general American discourse about Jews and the Jewish discourse about Jewishness, modernity, and political vulnerability. I argue that the most productive way to understand Dawidowicz's work, her historiographic tendencies or arguments, is to situate her in a continuum with the East European Jewish intelligentsia, who used history writing as a tool for the development of their nationalist commitments as early as the late 19th century. She was a pioneer of Holocaust historiography in the United States, and she represented an American link to Chorbenforschung, that is the research on destruction, which was inaugurated by East European Jewish historians well before the Holocaust. She is an American link in a transnational secular Jewish intellectual community of East Europeans writing history. So let me tell you a little bit more about her biography, which I think helps illuminate her commitments to this East European Jewish worldview. And we can look now at slide 4. Lucy Schildkraut, that was her maiden name, was born in 1915 in New York to a Polish Jewish immigrant family. And in many ways, she was a typical second-generation immigrant daughter. She was educated in New York City's public schools. She attended the prestigious Hunter High School for Girls, as well as its selective college. On the left of this slide, you see the very bright red cover of the literary magazine of Hunter College when she was the editor. There was an infatuation we can see with many intellectual immigrants with the English language and with English literature, including British English literature. And she was an English major. And she also was a youthful leftist. She was a communist in the Young Communist League for about 2 years. And this red cover illustrates her commitment to the Popular Front. On the right side of the slide, you see her graduation picture where she looks like a nice college graduate with her mortarboard when she graduated from Hunter, an all-girls school in New York City. At the same time that she was educated in New York City public schools and its selective colleges, she was also steeped in institutions committed to the ideology of Jewish diaspora nationalism, which is a worldview that believed that the Jewish nation, the people, preceded Judaism, and that the former, that is the nationhood of the Jews, through its autonomous institutions like the Kahal or the Kehillah, created and sustained the Jewish people in the diaspora. And in her childhood and adolescence, Lucy Schildkraut attended a supplementary diaspora nationalist Yiddish school, which was sponsored by a nonpartisan, a politically nonpartisan Jewish school movement called the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute. And she was very active. That was an after-school program and also weekend program, as well as going to its summer camp, Camp Boyberick. She was the editor of its journal called Schrift, and she wrote regularly, she wrote book reviews. And like other immigrants in the Yiddishist networks, she was acutely aware of the looming crisis in Europe, because I think it's very important to remember that the Jewish immigrant community in the United States had deep ties to Europe. Many people's family members were still in Europe. Many Jewish immigrants in what we now know they were the interwar years went back either to visit or to take pictures or to try and get relatives to immigrate, even before 1933, before the rise of Hitler in German lands and before the increasing economic crisis in Poland. So the ties between the New York immigrant community and Europe were very strong. And those activists in the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute were very tied to Europe. And that meant the young people in their midst were very aware. And at Camp Boyberick, Lucy Schildkraut had some very important relationships. And the two that I'll mention was her relationship with someone whose name is Leibish Lehr, who was an extraordinarily interesting figure in diaspora nationalist circles in the YIVO Institute. He was a social psychologist. He had studied at Clark University, and he was the camp director of Camp Boyblik. Boyblik was a Yiddishist camp. I could tell you so much more about Boyblik in the Q&A, but what I want you to imagine is kind of a mini Yiddish land in upstate New York, where the campers spoke Yiddish, performed in Yiddish, sang in Yiddish, spoke Yiddish, and were surrounded by camp counselors, many of whom were intellectuals. At the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute at its school that Lucy attended, the instructors, many of them were PhDs, including the historian Yakov Szatzki, an incredibly important Polish Jewish historian who had immigrated to the United States. And he was very active in the YIVO's American branch, which was called the Amaptel. That is YIVO, which was based in Vilna, already in the interwarriors. And then, of course, we'll see importantly during the war, had an American branch. And this will become very significant for what happens after the war, that the YIVO had an American branch. And Yaakov Szatzki was extremely active in the historian circle at the American YIVO. He influenced Dawidowicz, then Schildke, after her graduation with an English degree from Hunter, to consider switching her interest in intellectual pursuits to history. She had briefly gone to Columbia University in literature, but decided that it was no longer for her. In fact, she said, Keats and Wordsworth no longer spoke to me. And she began to do research at the Dorot division of the New York Public Library, which is still a magnificent archival and library collection on the Jewish press and the Yiddish press in England with Szatzki's encouragement. And then he urged her that if she wanted to study more Yiddish and more Yiddish intellectual history, that she should go to the great capital of secular Yiddish life. And that was Vilna, Poland, then in the interwar years in the Second Republic. So she applied to a program called the Aspirantur, which was the graduate fellowship program of the YIVO Institute. She was accepted by Max Weinreich, the YIVO's director, and she set sail for Poland in August 1938. And we can then look at a slide 5, and see here, this is among one of my many favorite archival documents. Here you have a clipping from the Vollwälds, one of the most popular Yiddish newspapers in New York, talking about this young American. You see her graduation picture on the left, going to the YIVO in Poland in 1938 to be in the Aspirantur, to be an aspirant. And we can now move to the next slide. These are the aspiranten, some of them, the graduate fellows and their teachers in the Vilna YIVO in 1938. And I hope many of you are thinking about what this meant for a young American post-college graduate, not sure what her future is, taking this incredible leap to go to Europe to study Yiddish and Yiddish culture. And I want us to also recall that in 1938, no one knew exactly what was going to happen if the war broke out. There was a sense that there might be a war, but certainly as an American, she did not know yet what war meant. And so that's important to keep in mind when we ask ourselves, why do people make choices? And also to be careful not to view the past through the lens of what we know happened. That's very, very essential to the historian's craft. The Aspirantur program had been established at YIVO during its 1935 year. And its goals were to train the next generation of researchers of East European Jewish history, language, and culture. And it drew upon, or its muse was the great Russian Jewish historian, Simon Dubnow, who was a diaspora nationalist. He actually gave a lecture at the YIVO when the Aspirantur was established. Dubnow's commitments to diaspora nationalism meant that he viewed, again, the Jewish nation as the vessel of Jewish life, not religion. And he viewed the institutions of Jewish communal life as the structures that allowed diaspora nationalist identity to develop. So he spent an enormous amount of his historical energy on looking at the Jewish communal life throughout Jewish history, looking at the various centers of autonomous Jewish life. And for Dubnow, the early modern and modern periods showed that Eastern European Jewry was in many ways the center of Jewish life. And this had a deep influence on all diaspora nationalist historians, including later we'll see Lucy Schildkret, and their commitment to Yiddish culture as the linguistic vehicle for guaranteeing the Jewish future. And Dubnow, in 1891, he wrote a really seminal kind of manifesto that informed many, many historians and young scholars about the need to collect and preserve documents of Jewish life. And this essay was called "Let Us Search and Research, a Call to the Wise Among Our People who Volunteer to Collect Material on Jewish life in Russia and Poland." And this essay really became the credo of 3 generations of East European Jewish intellectuals. And Lucy S. Dawidowicz becomes one of those individuals who felt charged with collecting and researching Jewish history from the perspective of the Jews and themselves. There were others involved with these projects. Some of you out there may know of the figure of Shayansky, who did an ethnographic expedition throughout Ukraine and parts of Poland collecting Jewish folkloristic material. There was a turn, if you will, to the people among East Europeans and East European Jews to collect their life as it was changing with modernity, to be able to write about it from the perspective of those communities themselves. That is, from the bottom up, what today we call bottom up history. And Dubnow was in many ways the mentor to all of those East European Jews afterwards who wrote Jewish history. The YIVO Institute, the Jewish Scientific Institute, or the Yiddish Wissenschaftliche Institute in Vilna, was indebted to Dubnow. As I said, he gave the talk at the Aspirantur's inaugural year, and he was, again, the kind of muse for it. And YIVO had a philological section, it had a linguistic section, psychological section, and it had a historian section. And the aspirantur, the aspiranten, worked with all of those groups. We can now look at the next slide. You can see here, and I realize it's in Yiddish and probably in small print, but this tells you the topics that the aspiranten, that is the individuals like Lucy, wrote about in their year of research. Many of the topics focused on Jewish daily life, the budgets of Jewish communities, the folk songs of the Vilna's poor, the psychological makeup of students. Schildkret, that is our Lucy, wrote about the Yiddish press in England, and you can see at the bottom in red, it says in Yiddish, it says Liebe Schildkret, New York, and her topic. So she was the only American in this program. And that means she came to Vilna with different assumptions and certainly a different socioeconomic profile. She was from the American Jewish working class, but as she wrote in her memoir, she never experienced the kind of poverty that she saw in Polish urban centers in the late 30s. The Great Depression in 1929 had a devastating effect on urban communities, and the Jews in Poland in the 30s were very, very impoverished. And it was a shock to her system to see that kind of poverty. This year, August 1938 to 1939, played an enormous role in Lucy S. Dawidowicz's consciousness. She not only encountered, as I said, poverty, street anti-Semitism, but she also encountered the luminaries of the Jewish secular intellectual elite associated with the YIVO. She met Avram Sutzkever, she met Zalman Rezen, she met Chaim Grade, that is the greats, poets and writers of Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe. She also had a sense of Poles and Lithuanians living side by side, not always in harmony with Jews of Eastern Europe. She also became extremely close to someone named Zelig Kalmanovich and his wife Riva, who were surrogate parents to her. She felt closer to them in some ways to her own parents. They embraced her. They took her under her wing. And Kalmanovich, about whom I could say much, much more, was an extremely interesting Yiddish secularist. He was a territorialist. That means he was a non-Zionist nationalist. Although his young son immigrated to Israel, to then Palestine, and saving his own life. But Kalmanovich was deeply critical of the left, deeply critical of communism. Remember, I said that Lucy was a young communist, and he influenced her in terms of thinking about Jewish identity in its widest perspective, even in periods of extreme poverty and anti-Jewish hatred, which will influence her as well. She thought about staying in Vilna for a second year. Max Weinreich, Vilna's director, hoped she would. Again, that gives you a sense that Polish Jewry, even in the summer of 1939, had no idea what lay before them. But when the Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed on August 23rd, 1939, the American embassy wrote a letter to all US nationals in Europe, basically saying, there will, in so many words, there will be a war. We now know that without the Soviet Union, which was the strongest army in Europe besides the Wehrmacht, the German army, there could be no true resistance, military resistance to the Germans once the Soviets decided to have a pact of neutrality. So Lucy took a train from Vilna to Warsaw, through Berlin, which was then gearing up for war, to Copenhagen, the only port, because Poland's ports were closed, where she could wait, which is what she did for about 3.5 weeks in Copenhagen, to get a boat back to the United States. Interestingly, Max Weinreich, who had been en route to a linguistics conference, also ended up in Copenhagen with one of his sons. So in those weeks from August 23rd to when she set sail in September, there she was with other Jewish refugees, even though she's an American and not exactly a refugee, in Copenhagen, watching now the war unfold, because in September 1st, of course, the Germans invaded Poland. Lucy arrived back in New York on September 29th, 1939. During the war, she worked as Max Weinreich's secretary at the skeletal New York YIVO. Remember, there was an American branch. And that means she was privy to all of Weinreich's efforts to maintain contacts with Vilna until 1941, when the Germans broke the pact, to try and figure out what was going on with his colleagues and what was going on with the archival holdings that YIVO had and of other libraries in Vilna. Again, this is a much bigger topic, but you may know that when the Germans decided to persecute the Jews, they also decided to destroy Jewish culture. And they set a kind of mini army of intellectuals to cull through the Jewish libraries and Jewish synagogues throughout Europe, collecting material for the future after the Jews were no longer. And they did this throughout Poland, where there were enormous riches of Jewish cultural libraries and archives. And they actually employed, quote unquote, or persecuted Jewish slave labor in the ghettos of Europe to collect these materials. And Vilna was a center of these Nazi efforts and with Jewish cultural resistance against them. And Max Weinreich, in touch with Jewish activists, Yiddishist activists in Europe, knew what was going on and trying to figure out what to do next. and Lucy was his secretary. So that gives you a sense that she, even though she's not yet on the stage as an intellectual, a public intellectual, she is privy to what's going on. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that she drew this map of the Warsaw Ghetto for Yivo Blätter, which is one of Yivo's journals, one of its publications. So already she is involved in her own way with beginning to document what we now can call the Holocaust. And with Weinreich, she worked on a very important bibliography of Yivo's publications from 1925 to 1941. And in the introduction to that, Weinreich wrote, and I quote, "The fact that a young co-worker from Yivo did the work here and there," meaning in Europe, "underscores for us the expression of continuity in Yivo's entire project." That is, he is showing that Lucy, he's intimating that she has a connection, unlike other Americans, with Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. She was there. After 1941, when the Germans invaded Poland and stormed through what had been Soviet-occupied Poland, the Jews of Eastern Poland were ghettoized and later would be liquidated. And by the end of the war, most of the people that Lucy had been incredibly close to had been destroyed, and the centers of Jewish life were destroyed. She decided after the war, she was still working for Weinreich, to go to Europe. She was employed by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee as an educational director. The Joint, among many extraordinary things that it did, worked in the American zone of post-war occupied Germany and worked in the DP camps to establish schools for children, right? The educational division of the Joint was responsible for getting materials to these schools. And Lucy was an officer of the Joint. And she worked with the Joint and with the Yivo to figure out what materials could be sent from the United States, including theater props, writing materials, pens and paper, as well as helping get second runs of books to the DP camps. So she became familiar with the books that had not been destroyed and that were collected in a huge German archive or depository, excuse me, in Offenbach, the Offenbach Archival Depot, to be able to get those books to the DP camps. She also worked with survivors who began to be engaged with collecting testimonies and publishing them in Yiddish. And we can go to the next slide. In the DP camps, a journal was produced called Von letzten Holben, translation from The Last Destruction. And you'll see here a Yiddish connection to the first and second destructions, that is, of the temples, the same word. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But she was instrumental in getting the Yiddish linotype so that this journal could be produced. And in so doing, she met a variety of lay historians and more trained intellectuals who were some of the first to collect testimonies from survivors of the Nazi terror. Again, this underscores this Dubnovian or East European ethos of doing history from, in this case, the victims themselves, right? This is not perpetrator history from how the Germans destroyed the Jews, but rather a perspective of the Jews, giving them agency, giving them voice for their experience. She worked, as I said, in the Offenbach Archival Depot. And when she was there, and remember, she's in contact with Max Weinreich the whole time. We have scores of telegrams that go back and forth between them, because she has noticed that there are many, many books that have Yivo's book stamp and also the book stamp of other archives and libraries from Vilna. Weinreich is very smart. He understands that because these treasures are in the American zone, he needs to work with the Library of Congress, with the American military government, and he is going to make a claim that anything that touched Vilna, which is where YIVO was based, would somehow be absorbed into into YIVO's property, right? Because no one in 1946 and 47 believed that there would be a future for Jewish research and Yiddish research in Europe. We can talk about what we know now, but remember, we have to put ourselves back in 1946, 47. So Weinreich was able to convince the American government, and Lucy in Offenbach was able to catalog material that ended up being 420 cases of books and archival and material culture. And these were shipped to New York in July 1947. And we can see the slide, next slide. This is a very famous, again, for those of us who work on this material, a very famous slide of the cases being opened up at the YIVO, including that of the Strashun, which is extremely important rabbinical library in Vilna. These cases contain, in so many ways, the remnants of East European Jewry and its cultural treasures. We now know that there are other materials still in Vilna. Some of you may know that the YIVO has a digitization project with Vilnius today in Lithuania. But all of these materials are now part of the YIVO's collection at the Center for Jewish History in New York. Lucy and Weinreich were intimately involved in this activity, along with someone named Seymour Pomerantz. And what's important for us to understand is that these materials are central to Holocaust studies today, right? Because anyone who wants to understand Jewish life in Eastern Europe before works on these materials. I can just tell you from personal anecdote, I just reviewed a book manuscript, a wonderful book manuscript, and so many of the archival collections in this book, I just want to keep it discreet, were in the YIVO's archives today. So this act of getting these materials from Europe to the United States is part of the legacy of Lucy Schildkret, Lucy Dawidowicz, and of course of Weinreich himself. She returned to the United States in December 1947, and she married Simon Dubnow. That's where she gets her Polish last name. He was a Warsaw native whose first family was murdered in the Warsaw Ghetto. Simon Dubnow had come to the United States in 1940 as a representative of the Jewish Labor Bund. His daughter, Tobcha, had been a ghetto fighter in Warsaw, and we could go to the next slide. And this is very, very important. Again, you can ask me about it in the Q&A. Lucy lived with the haunted memory of Tobcha Dawidowicz, as well as of his son, Jurek, and of his murdered wife. You see that there. She knew well what it meant to be a ghetto fighter, but she also believed strongly, as did many others, that resistance should not only be reified if it was physical, that resistance took many forms. And in fact, she was somewhat jaundiced about the preoccupation that many people have with resistance. She wanted to pay attention to how Jews lived and not to judge them if they didn't rise up in some form against the Nazi terror. She also believed, as many people have now come to conclude, that the comprehensive occupation of lands under Nazi terror left little agency. There was very limited agency for Jews and others caught in the maw of the Nazis, and that to focus on resistance is to mistake the imbalance of power between a minority, stateless people against the Germans, let alone the fact that we know that many countries with armies could not fight against the Germans. So I want you to just remember this picture, because it's not that she was hostile to ghetto fighters, but she thought there was an undue preoccupation with them. And I think it's important to note that. Let's skip ahead to the next slide very quickly. She also worked for John Hersey, a Gentile American who wrote one of the first English language novels about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And again, she did this because she needed the work, and she also did it because she was a Yiddish speaker and Hersey was not. And he used her research skills to get at some of the Yiddish sources about the ghetto uprising. But she had some qualms about this book. We can again talk about that in the Q&A. What I'm trying to show you is that even though she's not yet a public historian, she is beginning to hone her skills as one through her help with von Letzten-Holben, through her research for Hersey. And then, as we'll see, her next job, really in a job that she had for 20 years, when she worked at the American Jewish Committee. When she worked at the American Jewish Committee, she did so as a researcher. She started out as a secretary. And at the American Jewish Committee, she researched what was then called Negro-Jewish relations, anti-communism. Remember, we're in the freezing cold point of the American Cultural Cold War and the Jewish efforts to distance Jewish communism and the Jewish left from mainstream American politics. She is also involved with research on the crisis in urbanism in America and the effect of urban civil disobedience and more violent riots on the Jewish community. And she also is writing book reviews for commentary and other publications on East European Jewish life. So she's honing her research skills and beginning to publish much more actively on Eastern Europe. And the result of this is a book published in 1967, and we can see that slide, The Golden Tradition. The Golden Tradition is in many ways a what would be the best term, an entree or a first rehearsal for her major work on the Holocaust, which is, of course, the war against the Jews. But the Golden Tradition has a very, very long and a very, very powerful diaspora nationalist tinged perspective on East European Jewish culture. And even though the selections of the book are very, very varied, women, religious figures, historians, memoirists, the book's shape or the book's method is indebted to Dubnovian historiographic penchants, that is from the voice of the Jews themselves. And the last sections talk about Jewish life in extremis. So you see that in many ways, the Golden Tradition, which by the way is still in print and very, very useful as a primary source document or anthology of primary sources, it is indebted to this East European Jewish perspective on writing history and onto the sense that Jewish nationhood, Jewish collectivity is the best, if you will, vehicle for providing for a Jewish future. So you see here that history writing is not merely, quote, objective, but history writing for Dubnow, history writing for the Circle at the YIVO, and history writing for Lucy S. Dawidowicz is part of what creates a tradition or a heritage to protect the Jewish future. So writing about the Holocaust is not merely to document destruction, but to document the civilization that was destroyed so that future generations, particularly because she's a writer in English, future generations of American Jews will know about the culture that was destroyed. So she is absolutely hostile to the preoccupation with how to document how Jews are killed, and about survivors. She was not particularly open to survivors because for her, the culture was destroyed, the European heartland was destroyed, and that has to be recalled, remembered, and commemorated on its own terms. And that's what she does in the War Against the Jews, and that's what she began to do in the Golden Tradition. So let's move now to the next slide. I'm mindful of the time. I want to leave time for questions. So we can go to the next slide. This slide shows you my argument that East European Jewry was the cradle of almost every important Jewish cultural, religious, and national movement, and the area where Jewish faith, thought and culture flourished unsurpassed. This could be straight out of Dubnow's playbook. And in anthologizing these texts, I was guided by the desire to show the diversity of Jews and their culture, the centripetal and centrifugal forces that move them, and the variety they brought to Jewish thought and life. East European Jewry was not, as the sentimentalists see it, frozen in utter piety and utter poverty. So again, in 1967, she has a very open view of how to write Jewish history. It's interesting to think about if she would have said that now, or would her conservative political shift have shaped her writing history? But at that moment in 1967, she wanted to show all the diversity of Jewish life, believing that all of these components contributed to the vitality of Eastern European Jewish communal life. Let's go to the next slide. All of her work, except for the book on American Jewry, all of these show you how she was singed by the Holden, by the Holocaust. The golden tradition I've already talked about, the war against the Jews I'm going to move into. She also wrote a very important documentary history of primary sources, study of the Holocaust before anyone else. That's a Holocaust reader. Her work, The Jewish Presence, is really a meditation on Jewish identity, which is indebted to everything we've talked about: Jewish communal life, Yiddishism, Holocaust memory. The Holocaust and the Historians is her meditation on historiographic interventions into the writing of history, and her perception that antisemitism is not being paid enough attention to in the writing of national histories by the French and by the Germans and by the Americans and the British. And last, her marvelous memoir, From That Place and Time, which she wrote at the very end of her life, 1989, which is a document expressing her commitment to Yiddishism from her childhood until 1947. All of these works, and we can see in the next slide, are dedicated to figures who have been lost in the Holocaust. So the Golden Tradition was dedicated to Zelig Kalmanovich, 2 of 6 million. The War Against the Jews is dedicated to Shimon's children, Topcha and Zurich. A Holocaust reader is dedicated to the 6 million, and there's a citation from Kalmanovich's Ghetto Diary, which, by the way, I think will be published in English very soon, translated by Josh Carlip. The Jewish Presence is dedicated to Shimon himself, the Holocaust historian, to 4 great East European Jewish historians: Dubnow, Meir Bauerban, Ignacy Schipper, and Emanuel Ringelblum. Ringelblum was murdered. He was the chronicler of the Einik Shabbos. Bauerban also, he's buried in Okopowa in Warsaw. So this shows you again her debt to that East European Jewish ethos of writing history. Again, the American book is the outlier here. And then from that time and place, she dedicates to the Jews of Vilna with a citation from the liturgical commemorative poem Eli Eskara. So you can see that this is someone who is haunted by the destruction of East European Jewry. Let's move on to the next slide. The Golden Tradition gave her a public name. Even though she had written book reviews before, the Golden Tradition, this anthology that we've talked about, propelled her into the public sphere, in part because the male New York intellectuals, including people like Irving Howe, which I've already mentioned, reviewed her book in very notable publications, including the New York Times Book Review. It's important to remember that today we are all bombarded with so many different vehicles, literary vehicles, digital and otherwise, to read, that in some ways we don't have the same kind of sense of collective conversation because we're siloed on, if you read The Guardian, or if you read, this person's blog, or if you read the New York Review, or if you read Mosaic, or if you read Tablet, or if you read Haaretz, or whatever you read, the LA Times, you don't necessarily have the same sense that like-minded people are reading the same thing and there aren't that many vehicles. Well, in the post-war years, the New York Times Book Review, for Anglo being English readers, particularly New Yorkers, was kind of the go-to book, a go-to journal. So when Hal reviews her, she gets a public name. And she was invited to teach at Stern College, which is part of Yeshiva University. And she was actually invited to teach a course on Jewish social history and a course on American Jewish history. But it became very clear that really her expertise was on Eastern Europe and on the Holocaust, what became the Holocaust. So she taught one of the first college courses, a seminar on the Holocaust, and we have her syllabi. And it's fascinating because if you look at the syllabus, you see her perspective. She starts with ideological anti-Semitism. She starts with Hitler. She starts with Mein Kampf. So her intentionalist view, I already mentioned that at the beginning of my talk, that she believed that ideological anti-Semitism and the rhetoric associated with the destruction of the Jews needs to be understood as laying the ground for what later is the physical destruction of the Jews. So she's making a historiographic claim. Ideas matter, great men in history matter, and language matters. And this will be there will be pushback to this. And today we have, a kind of consolidation of various views. And also the field today has grown exponentially. And the kind of work that she did, a synthetic overview with limited access to East European archives, today you couldn't get away with what she did, right? Very few people write synthetic histories today. People write smaller studies, microhistories, and deeply archival based studies because we have so much more access to archives. Remember, in the 1970s, you couldn't go to Eastern Europe, and you didn't have colleagues who could digitize materials for you, and you didn't have the resources that we have today. So the fact that she did this at Stern College is quite extraordinary. And you can see that one of her problems is that she didn't yet have a synthetic book to use, which is why she embarked on writing The War Against the Jews. So let's go to the next slide. No, let's not. Let's go back. Sorry, I don't have the title slide of The War Against the Jews here, but The War Against the Jews becomes her, in many ways, her magnum opus. And in it, she lays out her perspectives that I've already suggested, but I want to underscore them even more. She writes the book in two sections. She writes it, the first section is called The Final Solution, which is about Hitler's rhetoric, everything that I already outlined, anti-Semitism, its beginnings already in Mein Kampf, and then particularly in 1933 and then in 1939. And then the second part of the book is called The Holocaust. And in it, she documents how the Jews of Eastern Europe, those in occupied Europe, reacted to what was happening to them. And so you see her commitments, ideology, great men in power, state authority, and then the response of the victims themselves. And the second section of the book, The Holocaust, is based, each of the chapters has the word community in it, the underground community, the illegal community, which highlights the fact that for Dawidowicz, again, indebted to Dubnow, believes that Jewish communal life is what sustains the Jews. So even in the ghettos of Europe, the schools, the illegal gardens, the Yiddish publishing, the collection of archival material by Emanuel Ringelblum and Onyx Shabbos is a communal act that helps to sustain the Jews spiritually and culturally. And that spiritual and cultural sustenance is what actually makes the Jews the Jews. That without culture, there can be no Jewish community. It's not merely the religious tradition, even though, and this is extremely important, she believed that Judaism, the practice of Judaism, informed Jewish culture. So in this, she has a break with the purely secularist or purely anti-clerical Yiddishists, many of whom she knew, and even her own husband, who was a Bundist and who was uncomfortable Jewish ritual behavior. As she grew older, and once her husband passed away in 1979, we know that Dawidowicz began to frequent synagogues and felt not exactly comfortable in Jewish religious practice, but felt that it was necessary to sustain Jewish life for the future. I want to mention one more ideological aspect of the war against the Jews, although there are many, and that is her contestation with Hannah Arendt. I could talk much more about the German Jewish perspective on Jewish life and modernization and the East European, but I'll just say briefly here that Arendt represents, in many ways, one pathway of West European and German Jewish acculturation. She is educated in the highest German institutions. She is involved with the circles of extraordinary Jewish German intellectuals, including Martin Heidegger. She does experience some of the barbarism of Nazism. She is briefly interned, but she is able to get to the United States. And when she gets to the United States, she is welcomed by the German Jewish Refugee Committee here, and I'm here, and also by New York intellectuals who are enthralled by her as a woman, as an intellectual. She teaches at the New School for Social Research. She also teaches at the University of Chicago. She is part of the circle of Jewish intellectuals in New York, including Salo Baran, a great Galician-born Jewish historian who ends up having a chair at Columbia. Lucy is a very different type. She doesn't have a doctorate. She's East European. She's a Yiddishist. She's appointed at a Jewish institution. So she and Arendt have very different biographies and very different perspectives. And in the war against the Jews, you see somewhat subtly, because it's only in a footnote, Dawidowicz's critique of Hannah Arendt's own critique of the Jewish political leadership before and during the war. Arendt famously criticized the Jewish communal leaders who were appointed by the Germans in the Judenräte, the Jewish authority structure in the ghettos. And the problem about the Judenräte is that these men were, some of them came from Jewish communal life beforehand, but as the war goes on and those ghettos lose their populations, they are often replaced just by figureheads that the Nazis put in power. That is, men who don't necessarily have a commitment to Jewish communal life. And even so, some of them who we now look at as being monomaniacal and preoccupied with themselves and having made choices that we find immoral, although we didn't live in their shoes, that even some of them were trying to protect the remnant of the Jewish community. And so Arendt roundly criticized them in Eichmann in Jerusalem, her reportage, a rather selective reportage of the Eichmann trial that takes place in Israel in the 60s. And this book was created a public and scholarly outcry. And Dawidowicz responds to it in The War Against the Jews, where she says forthrightly that none of the men of the Judenrat wanted a German solution, and that most of them, not all of them, but most of them believed that they were doing what they could do for the survival of the Jewish people. So here you see a very clear difference in the understanding of Jewish political power and Jewish historical agency. And again, I would argue that Dawidowicz, her perspective is informed by her understanding or her belief in Jewish existence, Jewish cultural existence itself as a form of power. And Dubnow believed this, and I believe she takes it again directly, not directly, but she's informed by him. And for Arendt, who had a more distant view of Jewish culture, did not see it that way. For her, political power was political power. And she thought that the Jews of Europe were feckless and powerless, and that the men of the Judenräte were complicit in the destruction of the Jews. So this is a huge issue in the war against the Jews. I think I will sum up now, and I welcome many questions. Towards the end of her life, we saw already a sense of despair Jewish historical writing on the Holocaust, a field, if you will, that she had helped create, had changed dramatically in the 1980s. There was much more of an interest in structural forms of anti-Semitism, the comparison of the Soviets and the Germans in terms of studies of totalitarianism. Arendt actually is very important in this in her earlier book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Scholars of the 1980s, many of them were new leftists who were indebted to Marxism and again, structuralism, and the idea of ideology and anti-Semitism being central to the understanding of the final solution had fallen out of favor. And even though she believed, as she said, that there was an intentionalist penchant or intentionalist drive to exterminate the Jews, and that most people agreed with it, she said in 1985, that's not exactly true. And so that most people agreed with her in the 1980s. So she felt a great sense of despair that she had kind of fallen out of favor. She had left teaching at Stern College. She was lecturing really throughout the country. She needed to support herself. Her husband had died. And that's when she expressed to Cynthia Ozick a sense of despair and wanting to destroy her papers. She decided at the very end of her life to return to kind of her glory days, the year in Vilna, and she wrote her magnificent memoir, I can't say it enough, From That Place and Time, 1938 to 1947. I had the great privilege to reissue it, so you can also still get it. It really spurred me to write her biography. And I'll close then with her picture, what she looked like at the end of her life. It's kind of a lovely picture of her. She doesn't look as despondent as I know she might have felt. And she also helped, the last thing I'll say before thanking you, is that she also collected money. She raised monies almost single-handedly for the translation of Yiddish literature into English. So Yiddishism, diaspora nationalism are the bedrock of Huldenforschung, of her perspective on the Holocaust. Without a Jewish community that nurtures its culture, in her case through Yiddishism and Jewish communal life, you can't tell the history of the Holocaust because you need to always recall the victims and the culture that was destroyed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I think that we are all clapping. It was really thought-provoking. Thank you for this archaeology of Dawidowicz intellectual trajectory and the different layers and how she became the historian and the really extraordinary woman and intellectual she was. I'm sure there are lots of questions, so please put your hand up or write in the chat. I can start off. Oh, there is someone from the Yiddish. Please.
You're going to moderate, right? I don't need to look in the chat now, right?
No, you don't need
Okay,
to.
great. Thanks.
Please, Yiddish Institute 28.
Ah, uh-oh. Who's that?
No.
Who is that?
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I follow you and try and attend as many of your lectures as I can. I have one comment, a very brief comment. When you said the Strashun Library was a rabbinic library, you'll forgive me, it wasn't entirely a rabbinic library. It was the model of the first Jewish public library in that it also
I meant rabbinic in terms of what it collected. Absolutely.
You know, and it was incredibly important. Communal institution as
100%.
And so my question here is, when did the move to the right begin and what kept her there?
So first, I want to, YIVO Institute 20, I want to thank you very much for your comment. Destruction, when I say it was rabbinic, it was started by a rabbinic family, but it was bequeathed to the city of Vilna. And it was open to everyone. And you, if one could imagine, right? I mean, in some ways, it's comparable today. If you go, for example, if you have the privilege to spend time at the Jewish division in the Israeli Public Library, you know, the National Library in Israel, or you were to go to the Durot division today in New York, or, you know, I don't know, forgive me if the British Library is suspected a separate Semitics or Jewish section, but where you see all types, right? Every single type is looking at it. And that is, and or the Center for Jewish History today, if you go into the reading room there, you'll see every size, shape of person. It's really gratifying. So that,
and it was open on Shabbos.
What?
And it was open on Shabbos.
That's right. And there were
for
debates.
The working people.
Right. That, and there were debates about it. So 100%. And by the way, there's a rather recent book on the Strussian Library, in which, by the way, there's also some contested opinions about Weinreich and Lucy Schildkraut by Dan Rabinowitz. I'm just forgetting the title right now, but I do know it. It's like Forgotten Library or something. And there's a lot of history there that's very, very important. What is important for the Lucy Max Weinreich story is that Weinreich did everything he could to get what remained of Strauss-Schoen as part of this 420 cases that got sent to New York. And you know, how one evaluates that now, I would just say we should think hard about what we know today and what we knew in 1947. And I personally think that I'm saying what I rarely do this. I think in 1947, Weinreich was genius. I mean, he was politically savvy. He knew who to talk to in Washington. He got the American Army to pay for it, and the Library of Congress. I mean, and he did this, by the way, I know I'm not answering your other question, I will. You know, later on, and this is what makes the story the story is always so interesting. Selah Baran, who Lucy had studied with at Columbia, and Selah Baran, who's close friends with Hannah Arendt, create Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, Inc. And they become then the American overseeing institution to deal with all the other property. But Weinreich had already made his claim that YIVO should have this material. And that was very smart. Well, it's very smart if you think it was good that it went to New York. Because this whole time between 1945 and 1950, everyone and their mom are trying to get that material, right? Including Gershom Scholem, who I didn't mention. But Scholem is just stealing things. So anyway, you're absolutely right about it. I find this topic so compelling because it's all the same people. And we're living in a moment, a very important moment, where museums and collectors and everyone is doing a reckoning about how did we get this material? Do we really own it anymore? Should the Met return this? Should the Louvre return this? These are extremely important questions. But you have to ask yourself, when was the stuff collected and why? It's one thing if you have a, quote, Orientalist expedition from Britain going and plundering African villages, than a diaspora refugee Jew who's trying to figure out how to get this stuff out of the maw of the Soviet Union. Okay, enough defensiveness about Weimar. Full stop. But you have YIVO there, so
you don't need to. You don't need to be defensive with me about Weimar.
No, I just wanted everyone to know that your question is. So about the turn to the right. So look, again, she died in 1990, which means that I can sort of stop my story in 1990. Which helps me out a lot because the political look, and this is true, by the way, in Eastern Europe, and now we can say this modern state of Israel and the United States, you know, we now have a period of what happens after the fall of the Soviet Union and what happens. And did all of us in the world know what would happen? And what happens initially, at least in certain places, is an opening up, a democratization, an opening up of particularly in a place like Poland, the recognition of Gentile-Jewish relations, or an assessment of pre-war anti-Semitism during, you know, all of these questions and real openness. And then we have this other phenomenon, a pushback to that, right? Which I think is where we're all now, we in the world, right? Right-wing governments, in Turkey, in Israel, in Poland, right? In Belarus, Russia. So this whole question of what happens to the right, how does it morph, how did it change? I'm not a political scientist. I get to stop my story in 1990. But when did she begin to move to the right? She began to move to the right. You really see it in a very articulate way, kind of in the late 70s, when the upheavals in New York, in LA, when the New Left turns violent, when the New Left symbolically embraces violence. I think one of the challenges for an historian now is when we go back and look at the New Left, most New Leftists weren't violent, but there was enough violence on the streets. There was enough violence on college campuses. There was enough rhetorical violence, in poetry, that it's colored in some ways how we assess the whole. And there was a lot of state violence, right? A lot of state violence. So I think what I said in the book, I think that American Jews of immigrant origin who had experienced, and in her case, she experienced what she called hooliganism in the streets of Poland, and were still they hadn't suburbanized, right? Jews, we know, by the way, were white, coded white, and left the cities, but many Jews stayed behind in the cities, right? Mm-hmm. White flight, many Jews did not embrace white flight or did not go to the suburbs, even though we know 50s, 60s, 70s, we have the growth of suburbanization and suburban Jewish life. But she lived in Queens, and then she lived in Manhattan, as did many Jews. And they felt vulnerable. They felt vulnerable. And the institutions that had given them a leg up, the GI Bill, the government. Lucy's passport was American, that got her out of Europe, right? Without that American passport, right? She couldn't have. The American government got the books from Europe to America, right? Universities, the colleges, the free colleges, all of those institutions of what we now call meritocracy, even though we now understand, anyone who's sensitive understands, that they were biased in terms of people of color, that they didn't recognize the obstacles to people of color, former slaves, Jim Crow, everything we know, we have to recognize that. But for someone like Dawidowicz, that was what had allowed Jewish safety and security in the United States. So when those institutions became part of the critique of the New Left, like the universities are complicit in the building of the bomb, and the cities are no longer good for people of color, and the police, someone like Dawidowicz recoiled from the left and the liberal. And then the most important thing, or not the most, is what happens in terms of rhetoric about the post-6-day war, right? After the 6-day war, and we need to remember that there was a lot of ambivalence on the part of many people about the occupation of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Shtachim. I'm using all the terminology so no one gets upset, because that's what happens all the time. Whatever word you use, code you. So I'm going to just use all the words. No one knew what it would look like. And, but people in the New Left viewed what had happened after the 6-day war as an occupation, and paralleled it with other occupations that they were fighting against, including the war in Vietnam. So for someone like Lucy Dawidowicz, for whom, and she says this to Irving Howe, the modern state of Israel was the embodiment of the Jewish people. I mean, that's diaspora nationalism. That says sort of everything about who she was. She wasn't thinking about the government. She wasn't interested. For her, politics were communal life. Now, one may disagree with it, but that's the way she saw the world. Again, based on Dubnow's conception of a spiritual nation. So when the left began to embrace a critique of the modern state of Israel, she was like, I'm done. I'm done with the left. And she stayed there. She moved to the, she already was a liberal and not a communist. That happened in her youth and during the years of the American Jewish Committee, and she was a Roosevelt Democrat and all that stuff. But she pulled the lever for Reagan, and since '84, and she urged American Jews to do the same. And I'll say, I know I keep saying, I'll say one last thing. What I think is very complicated about this understanding of the right is that the economics of the right, she was somewhat oblivious to it. Meaning, today, when we assess the Reagan years, there's so many things to talk about, but the economic policies of the Reagan years, she seemingly was unaware of what I would say is the impact of those policies. She wasn't an economist. She was fighting the culture wars, as were many other people. So I think I answered a lot of questions and probably
Thank
You did.
Nancy.
Thank you.
You did.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for a very full response. We still have a few questions and very, well, little time left. Marion or Marian. You need to unmute yourself.
Hi, Nancy. That was just amazing. My mind is kind of reeling because this is a whole area that I knew nothing about. I'm a descendant of German Jewish refugee and Austrian refugee, and I haven't really thought an awful lot about all these issues. So thank you so much for giving such an amazing picture. But while I've got a question which doesn't directly relate to your huge amount of research, but it relates to pre-war anti-Semitism in the United States. And I've been very struck by this 6-hour documentary by Ken Burns, The US and the Holocaust, which has been shown here recently in the UK on the BBC, and all the material that he gathered to make this documentary. Are you familiar with it? I'm not sure.
Well, I'm familiar with it. I'll be honest, I haven't watched it. You know, it's one of the things.
Sure. Sure.
I feel a little bit like I'm channeling my subject. You know, I'm now working on an interwar Polish Yiddish journalist, and all I want to do is work on him. And I'm, it's the whole question of American Jews and the Holocaust. It's sort of like, do I have to think about that? And then I think, well, I should watch it because then I can respond better. So I certainly.
But what he does is look at anti-Semitism, how it informed the American response in the run up to the war, and Lindbergh and whatever. But what I can't quite get, when you talked about her going to Vilna in 1938 and witnessing things for the first time, I was thinking, did she not see what was happening in Europe over the 1930s? Or was it just not in her?
No, I think she definitely knew what was happening. I mean, she writes, some of you may know in the 1930s, there were certain members of kind of the Christian Polish intelligentsia said, well, the solution to the Jewish problem, right? Remember, Poland has the largest population of Jews, in non-communist Europe in the 1930s. Warsaw is the second largest Jewish city in the world, New York being the first, which I think is, it's so important to say that, only because to understand that the gravitas, the demographic gravitas has shifted to the New World, right? Which is not what Jews were Europeans. So now they have to encounter America. It's a completely different society. I mean, trust me, completely different society. And the way Jews have to shape themselves is really different. She did know what was going on, but
it was going on in New York. I saw.
No, but what was going on in New York, look, just like the way poverty, I think it's important. So it's the degrees of difference. So Lucy, like many girls who went to Hunter College, I want to give a shout out to Hunter because it's an incredible place, and everyone always talks about City College, but City College was single sex and Hunter was single sex women. I'm telling you, those women were powerhouses. It's just that many of them didn't work outside the home, what we say now. So, and they became wives and mothers or secondary school teachers. They're incredible, right? But we don't think about them. They were women, they were wives, but those women were incredible. Many of them took teacher's license, took the test to be teachers, and she failed the test because of her accent. There was anti-Semitism in the New York City public school systems. People felt it, but it was a social anti-Semitism. There was no legislative disenfranchising of Jews the way there was after Nuremberg, right? So it's a social anti-Semitism. It's unpleasant. People change their names. I commend a book by a colleague of mine, Rosenberg, by any of their names. Jews accommodated in the United States by passing. I mean, I could go on and on about this, changing their names, trying to figure out if they were in Jewish neighborhoods, how not to look Jewish. I'm not saying that's not real and not traumatic. It is, but that's a whole host of different things than being subject to legislation. And by the way, there was no legislation in Poland, anti-Semitic legislation. I'm not saying there was hooliganism, there was violence on the street, but even the numerus clausus, right, the segregation of Jews on ghetto benches was university driven, and some universities tried their hardest not to do it. That's very different than state legislative de-emancipation, which is what went on in Germany. So vis-a-vis, it's apples and oranges. Jews still had legal recourse in the United States. The other thing is about what happened during the war. And again, I'm not a policy person. I think the perception that the United States has always been open to immigrants is somewhat mythic. And
that's what Burns says.
Yeah, and you know, there's someone, Matthew Fry Jacobson, always mentioning bibliography as if I think you're all going to have it. It's a very fine historian at Yale who talked about the mythology of Ellis Island from the set when it became a myth, when it became like in the popular imagination that everyone comes through Ellis Island and everyone's allowed, da, da, da. What it does is ignore the millions of people who came to the United States in chains. So these narratives of America being always open already is problematic. And then the way Jews were able to be successful in the United States, not all Jews, but many Jews, and therefore they embrace this narrative, means that then when they look back at the 30s, they go, wait. But then they want to point the finger. So partly the problem is they should get rid of the initial mythology and understand that American immigrant policy has always been fraught from day one. It has to do with labor needs. It has to do with racism. You know, think about if you're on the West Coast, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I think one of the issues is the ways in which American Jews need, and I say this for all peoples need narrative myths. And then when they're punctured, everyone gets upset, which is understandable, but a healthy society can look at its warts.
Yeah.
So full stop. I mean, I have a lot more to say about it because look, this is what historians do. We are faced with the overturning of myths and wondering why earlier generations were indebted to those myths. What were their sources? Why are our sources different today? Are we really so much smarter than our predecessors? No, but we have different, we have to stay in business, so we have to rewrite things. And also we have a new perspective.
Sure.
And that shapes the way we look at a document that my predecessors would have said, well, that's so great. And now we look at it, we see nuances that we didn't see before. So I hope I addressed that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nancy and Mario. I have two more questions and we will probably need to be a bit shorter. From Cynthia Mindo, who is asking two questions. I will ask them separately. So first, is Von letzten Horben Journal of Survivor Testimonies available in digital form? And are there more volumes aside from the one Nancy shared?
That's a great question. So my advice to you is to go to YIVO and go to the National Yiddish Book Center. So YIVO is a scholarly archive, and if you go, and it's within the Center for Jewish History, and if you put in von letzten Horben, you'll see what pops up. The National Yiddish Book Center in Western Massachusetts has digitized extraordinary things. And I have to thank Steven Spielberg for that. And seriously, I mean, it's just, I mean, things you wouldn't think you would find, you find. I mean, I ended up I'm working on this Yiddish journalist, and this Polish Yiddish journalist wrote a biography of Ilya Ehrenberg, very important member of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And that biography was published in Yiddish in 1968, and it's digitized by the National Yiddish Book Center. It's like great for me. So I don't have a specific answer about von letzten Horben. There's an enormous effort to digitize, but in terms of Eastern European Yiddish writing, there is so much material. I mean, yeah.
Okay, and she has another more general question. What might Lucy's research focus be today, especially given the emphasis, at least in popular cultures, on stories of resistance and survival in the Holocaust?
Can you just repeat the first clause of your
So
question?
what might Lucy's research focus be today?
You know, I think that she very much felt out of step with his preoccupation. She did feel out of step with his preoccupation with resistance. And she hoped that she would be able to write a comprehensive history of the Jews in the United States. And she has a wonderful essay on Jewish economic life that was really prescient in terms of the economic turn. You know, she wanted to look, speaking to Marianne, who talked about German Jewish, you know, at the German Jewish immigrants, the peddlers, what people did who went to, you know, the Northwest and the Southeast and what they did. And she looked at credit histories, very, very cutting edge for her time. But at her time, there weren't enough collections that one could write a synthetic history of American Jews. I mean, now we have various synthetic works, Jonathan Sarna, Hasia Diner, you know, that you can really use because all these other people have done the micro studies. That's really, excuse me, that's really what she wanted to do because she felt that American Jewry was so significant in that regard, demographically, and also, as I said, sort of the cultural gravitas. Also, Salo Baran, her teacher at Columbia, believed strongly in writing American Jewish history, which is that's a fascinating topic on its own. But she couldn't get to it. So she just wrote that one book. It's called I think it's called, I'm forgetting right now, but it was an essay published in the American Jewish Yearbook on the centenary of immigration from 1881 to 1981. And that was kind of her first stab. So it's impossible to know what she would do. I think, you know, today's world of Holocaust studies is so vast. I mean, I don't need to tell you, we have individual studies of ghettos, we have individual studies of women, we have individual studies of passing, economics. I mean, the field is exploded, and the access, and also I want to shout out to my colleagues in Eastern and Central Europe. You know, we now have many scholars at centers we never would have imagined. University of Wrocław, University of Warsaw, Jagiellonian. I mean, Russia, I don't know what to say about Russia these days, but in Lviv, I mean, I've lectured in Lviv. People interested in Jewish urban history, people interested in Polish-Jewish relations, I mean, who are European, who have the languages that someone like Lucy didn't have. You know, she didn't know Ukrainian, she didn't know Polish, she didn't know Russian. So the field is very, very different today. She couldn't really compete, I would say, in today's world of Holocaust historians.
Thank you, Nancy. And final question from Douglas, very briefly, if possible. Douglas Pilzer. Are you still here?
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Dr. Pilzer, I'm a philosopher. I think Roosevelt, okay, it was, you know, he could have done a lot more, don't you think? Or how you feel about Roosevelt?
You know, I really address it in my book. So I urge you to look at that chapter. And, you know, I think we kind of talked about it a little bit with Marian's question about the Ken Burns documentary. So I don't think I need to expatiate right now on that.
Thank you so much. So really on behalf of the Parks Institute, on behalf of the Carlton trustees also who attended the lecture and who wanted to really thank you for this excellent, very compelling, really passionate lecture. So yeah, we are really happy that you gave us this lecture. And have a wonderful evening. We'll see you. The next Parks event will be on the 6th of March. And then we will have the Montefiore lecture on the 9th of March. Keep all well. Have a good day.
Thank you, Claire and Professor Kushner. All good things.
It was really great.
Thank you.